So today we have Fred with us. Fred, do you want to do a quick introduction?
Sure. Um, my name is Fred Wilmot. I'm CEO and co-founder of a company called Detecteam. Uh, I've been around a while. I've used Lehman Charlie extensively. I've built some things that are, security operations platforms, built a lot of detection content, and defended a few organizations as a CISO and so on and so forth. So, plenty of battle scars.
Right, right. The CISO part of this, I think, is interesting to get folks with that side of the experience because it's pretty unique, right?
I think the interesting part is combining that with somebody that's done operational security, right? More often than not, I think the conversation steers towards like, and it's pretty funny in some Slack channels, there'll be guys that are sort of like, oh, well, I mean, CISOs, kind of a thing. And it's like, well, hang on. You're probably 60 to 70% right on that, but the 30% is probably you might be presumptuous there. And the challenge is just you don't know, right? So the CISO challenge, how do you communicate business risk? How do you talk about business priorities, right? The other side of that operational risk is, how do you actively understand what it is you're trying to mitigate? How do you make your money worth the spend? How do you make your team better? How do you, create quality amongst the chaos that exists? And yeah, I mean, it's tough. It's a thankless, tough job. There are plenty of good people trying to do the work right. Kudos to them.
That's right. That's right. And I think today you kind of had like on your mind the tagline I think was cloud detections in the age of cloud SaaS or something like that. So
Yeah.
I'm curious what's on your mind.
Well, I think Krista and I were just sort of having a rap sesh briefly, and I sort of like was like, "Hey, well, what do you think we should talk about?" And this topic came up. I think part of the thing that I think has become very interesting and coming out of RSA, I think there's a lot of topics around this too, is identity is still a thing. Identity and cloud things have become more interesting. And when we look at sort of the pervasiveness of some of the global highlights on threat, right, there's a whole coalition of folks that are talking about where, things like the attacks on O365 and Azure and the behaviors that are happening in Google and some of the agentic attacks on identity have become something really, really interesting for people. And it's the coalescing of the types of information that make those things relevant from a detection perspective. And it's kind of an open-ended problem, I think. One of the things that we do, right, is we do some analysis around this from, let's say an agentic slash MCP perspective for analysis when somebody brings a new sort of interesting threat to the table. And we think about it more in the threat-centric view of things to get to, this other part where we write, detections or what have you. And the process for that, we're shifting our process for that right now because in today's parlance of cloud tools, right, if you would say that I wanted to go grab, this vulnerability, or I wanted to get this sticks object from, a qualified source, there's not as much information available around where and how to manage the context of identity with respect to that. So we're changing some of our process around that right now to go out and investigate that before doing other taxonomy choices, like which particular service of Microsoft is likely going to be affected by this particular type of identity. And I think earlier, you had I am a fan of Defender Friday. So you did a thing with Vici a while back on Arcvuscator, right? We love Arcvuscator. It's a pretty cool thing. But in looking at that in the context of how every tool internalizes something like encoding, and the behaviors that happen with identity, we're seeing with a bunch of the different standards of identity passing, and I'm not just talking about OAuth tokens, but uh, that being passed as a function of the application, for cloud services, in conjunction with web services has become a very interesting problem. So when we start chopping that into pieces, what we found is we don't have enough information without some network-centric approach to what that looks like as it passes across the wire. So we started taking some of that information and running it through uh, network traffic analysis first, and then applying it to what we have as, scenario-based stuff in language.
Okay,
So
so I,
yeah.
I'm curious. So you said like network analysis, and like I feel like that's kind of the thing we hear about the least these days. Does that do you require seeing under transport encryption to go and kind of start modeling these types of threats, or can you do it at over the encryption?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the encryption is the real true part of that problem. And so I think uh we're kind of focused on making sure we understand sort of the transport mechanism appropriately so that we can infer based on the context of the application some of the appropriateness of that. Um, I'd love to say that we could basically, I mean, we can, here's the thing that we can do, right? So we wouldn't say we would go break all the things, but what we can do is we can take a network traffic capture and turn it into a scenario, right? So let's say somebody else goes and breaks some of the details. What we're trying to figure out is when and where do we grab that information to appropriately put it in the methodology for creating a scenario so that it actually has the value of the use of that, right? So, uh, two previous companies ago, right, we would say that that's a identity provider. We would say that these interesting things around SAML tokens become very trusting, right? And so you would say if this particular identity provider had like a dashboard you logged into, and then you clicked on this widget had token, you automatically had auth and so on and so forth. So, a lot of the golden token attacks sort of theoreticals there, delegated authentication, these types of things. And as more and more of these cloud companies say, hey, look, I don't really want to manage your identity. I don't want to deal with that. I'll just take a delegated token, right? This becomes more prolific. So, imagine us, right? We're a SaaS B2B business. I know some other guys that are SaaS B2B businesses, right? And so some of the risk is like, okay, well, I'm just going to inherit, trust the authentication part, right? I'll provide some authorization, so I'll do the auth for me. But as you think about all of the applications where you're providing the same context to, they don't all handle it the same way, right? And so the risk for us is trying to figure out how that sort of motion around delegated auth can help incentivize better ways to do detective work. And some of that, if you look at like some of the folks that are doing the passwordless pieces, where they're also there's another level of that where they're taking and creating another session of behavior that happens in there. And so, is that an appropriate place to create detection? So this is what we've been sort of working on. I think coming out of the conversations at RSA, I was a little like, I'm not sure, this is like a winnable war kind of a situation right now, but we should totally take this approach and see if we can get some more applicability. Because the challenge is, I think, the way that we're looking at where identity moves today, a lot of everybody's detective juice is spent on, the EDR problem of the universe and SIMS, the XDR pick thing, the deal. Um, and it's difficult to incorporate the right amount of context for, say, an identity with respect to that if it's not something that lives and breathes in your environment. So it's compounded by, what we are now being bombarded with as third-party risk for integrated apps and all this other stuff. Like, how do you quantify the risk of that, whether it's your auth or it's delegated auth? And so that's the thing we've been, banging our heads against to try to figure out. And just using some of the means, that we have, right? One of the things that we should talk about is imagining that I have some level of authentication that happens, and I can see this right from let's call it a sensor, right? And then I can take that and I can incorporate that directly into a scenario that helps understand both the user perspective on the device as well as to do something there. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. Are you guys seeing this as well?
Well, I feel like I think it's super relevant to last week's, I think, even Defender Friday discussion where we were talking about things a lot from the MITRE perspective. And to me, it feels like that's the thing that is missing if it's possible, right? And I think that's kind of what you're circling in a way around is, we have a really good handle on how to define, various parts of the attack framework, the endpoint. And like, I honestly, like, I don't know, is MITRE attack even attempting right now to define some of those? I would think the challenge is that, to your earlier point, different platforms treat things in pretty different ways. And do you think we've reached a point where we can start to say, okay, these are the categories of things, and how the attacks are made, and how we can start thinking about defending? Or is it still kind of chaos?
Yeah, I think the categories exist, but they're so meta, it's not as relevant, right? Because I don't know, and again, this is just my opinion, but getting identity right and getting identity wrong is literally the hardest problem. And then add what happens when I do this, sort of the behavior, right? So if you understand the application flow of, all of the things that you own, great. But more often than not, you're subject to, as a provider, subject to, whatever methods that those identity management tools or passwordless authentication tools or any of those, IAM solutions, CIM solutions, CAM, CNAT, all the things that produce an output that you then consume, you're subject to the trust model problem, right? Which is always going to be there. And I don't know, right, if you think about it from an auth perspective or a delegated auth perspective, where those things, context matters so much there that I don't know you can put enough labels on it to get descriptive or discrete enough for it to matter.
Yeah, it feels like maybe it's the classic pendulum effect here, right? Where we've gone now quite a bit on the decentralized way, and like, as a user of off providers, like, this is great. I love JOTS, but at the end of the day, once it leaves your environment, like you're saying, what happens there, who knows? And I think even though the technology is really interesting, the other part of that problem space feels like it's a human understanding, right? I think about it like the ACL system in Windows. Like, if you don't know much about like the ACL system in Windows, incredibly complex, and you can do all these scenarios, like amazing stuff. In practice, maybe I can count on one hand the number of people I know that actually understand truly, the system, and I'm not one of them. So I feel like OAuth
Yeah.
is a little bit of that, right? There's so much of, oh, I got the prompt, it asked me to allow, and I clicked allow.
Right. Right. Well, and to your point, I think there's another couple of really interesting parts of that problem is when, let's say that's, you have a trust and you're just trusting that, the authentication, right? Let's say you don't, right? And it's a user-based prompt, right? It's multi-factor and whatever. And give me your, authenticator, 6-pin code or whatever, right? From your phone. Okay. Well, the complexity there is my phone, right? According to the business, a trusted device. Maybe yes or no, right? Maybe it's not managed. Maybe I don't care. In this model, zero trust, we would say, I don't care. Okay. But I repeatedly send you, 500,000 6 pins codes, right? Is that me trying to brute, right? Exactly. As me trying to brute, this particular thing. And then you've got the other parts of this that you hear about tons about, right? Like the smishing this and so on. And so you've extended this sort of mesh. Uh, you've extended this mesh to be something like you have the device problem, plus you have the identity problem, and we say zero trust here. So, but as a business, as a company, as a small team of ragtag fugitives building detections to try to keep something, outside the door, still outside the door, you've got to disambiguate that from the behavior of the application, right? To understand the context of where that's relevant. As an identity provider, you can go, yep, you know what? Look, I'm gonna elevate trust, or I'm going to remove trust in this. Beautiful. Yes, thank you for the Battlestar Galactica. That is beautiful. Um, the challenge is like, how do you decide, right, when to escalate based on risk? And you can do that as an identity provider, right? But if you're not that provider, right, then you're going to get whatever the outcomes are. So just to get to a place where I might say, here, I'm going to pass you this delegated. Oh, there's all this other stuff that I do ahead of time as a provider and interacting with, a user in this sense, and then you have whatever the outcomes are. So, a little bit like with the delegated auth, we hit the I believe, and I'm just going to map you to my roles and here's the scope and the realm and and okay, good. Now you can use these applications that you've gotten the entitlements for or whatever. But how you got there is the interesting question, and how much level of trust, and then how do you look at the variance of that type of stuff as it matters? Because I'm talking about something it sounds probably a little bit esoteric the way I'm describing it, but the simple truth is like, I'm going to log into my O365 account and send a handful of emails, right? Some of those may be phishing, some of those may be, targeted, emails, right? In that particular case. And, something bad happens as a result of that. Maybe it's my intent that something bad happens, but I followed all the right things. I was able to authenticate. I am authorized to operate said environment. And, I'm still at the front end of all of the things in the taxonomies, right? Spear phishing is pretty high up there, right? So when you look at that and you try to associate that with behaviors like in ransomware, you've got, everything that happens past that. I chose not to, chose not to exploit. There's a lot to be said there. Um, Yeah, good thoughts on the device trust part. I think there's, the device management is a really important part of that, and the access management is a really important part of that. There's ways to get around that. It's a good point to bring up. But the part that I think is intriguing here on where to sort of make these two things coalesce is I now have to attribute the context of that identity behavior plus the authenticity of that with the application flow, right? And that can be very different. So, what does that mean? Well, I log in, right, in my corporate office. If I still had a corporate office, I log into, Microsoft, right? And it connects me up to 15 things. And it's, all of my auth between all of my services do X, Y, Z, yada, yada, yada. And, I go to my SharePoint, I go to my, PowerPoint this and all of those things. It's those cases where, the challenge that you have is the context of, is that user the user, right? And then also, do those applications perform the way they are normally meant to? So now, right, if you button in this first part of identity into the application behavior, now you're saying, okay, like, does Fred normally use Teams? Well, the honest answer is, you know, eh, only if you shove a hot poker in my eye would I do that by choice, right? Because I don't love Teams. But corporate policy would say that I don't use Teams, right? I use Google Meet or something. And so now you tie a valid, authenticated and authorized user to an application behavior. And I guess that's my point, right? So like, there's so much context in here to look at application behavior, to understand, identity in the realm of cloud tools. And you don't necessarily have all the logs to do it, right? And so, you know, that's ultimately like the crux of the thing that we're trying to, stumble on here a little bit.
Yeah, I wonder if, I usually try to kind of map problem spaces to things we've seen before, and talking through this kind of authentication, delegated authentication, and kind of the enforcement part of that. I can't help but feel that it's just a reduction to what we've been doing, just about computers and the network at large talking to each other, and talking to applications that we don't know at all what they are and could do vastly different things. So I kind of wonder, if that's just an untractable problem, and the last thing that you kind of said ends up being the most valuable, where maybe the standardization, or the, the new definition that we need isn't on the enforcement side, but on the logging side of this, about finding a way to have a common language to describe at a high level the things that are happening in different systems and how they relate. Because I think trying to go all the way down, probably not going to work out. There's way too many details, right?
Uh,
But with LLMs nowadays, I'm thinking like, hey, if I had this kind of language that describes all the things my off is doing across the world, across all SaaS, and I could apply, like more contextual language around that, like I might get really good stuff from that.
I think that's an interesting idea, one to consider. I wrote it down, Max. Like that's a thing we should genuinely think about
Yeah.
because you're right. I think the other challenge is like we only have a couple taxonomies, right? For which to the universe sort of equates to detection engineering in that sense, right? One of it is minor attack, right? And obviously there's a lot of depth there that doesn't really, it gets relegated, right, in the process, but it's okay. It's what we have, and it is effective to some degree. And then you have, right, some other mostly MITRE standards, right? So you can also look at defend here, and then you can also look and see where, other people have devised some taxonomies of standards to understand classes of attacks. Cool. I mean, even cyber insurers are doing this now, right? Because it has some, it has more than anthropological uses for them in the sense of, the actuarial science of what the actual threats matter in their world and so on. But the question of where that plays out around, this taxonomy for identity is a super interesting one, and maybe we should try to figure this one out. I mean, genuinely, because as we continue to progress here, the way that we do business, and also the way that we have to craft detections and get access to information, you're probably asking a CSP for some of that information, right? You may not have it. And it's interesting to think about where, what Google will give you, right? And, you have a good basis of understanding on this problem, right? Versus, what you can get from Amazon. Does Amazon really have an identity provider? Questionable. Google does, Microsoft does. So when you look at this, you go, okay, there are some things that we can extract here. How do you help influence the value chain of what that data is an important thing. And maybe this concept on this taxonomy can also be related to other providers that aren't those folks, but still operate in those environments. And that might be really compelling.
It's the eternal problem we've always had in cybersecurity, right? Just getting everybody to agree. I feel like that would be a really interesting study and paper on why did MITRE attack, and I would kind of argue like Sigma and like Suricata kind of, or Yara, how did these actually make it through? Because the number of open three acronym letter, uh, there's a graveyard for that, and that's really challenging. I feel like I'm guessing that MITRE would probably be in the best spot to do that, but then again, identity is very different than EDR type, like ontology, right? Like it's
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, to your point, I think there's obviously a huge movement into OCSF to write out, detection language and stuff. And you have Yara and, SecOps now using Yara L. And I understand they might be moving away from that, fingers crossed. But, each of these perform different functions, right? So like Yara L isn't going to give you the taxonomy of a normal, thing. However, it's super valuable, right? So one of the things that we did early was like make this giant map of all the fields that could be relevant if you were going to create an Uber, detection language, as it were, without creating another language, but just a map. not a language. And what was interesting was if you looked at the co-occurrence in say like, a KQL and SPL, right, and a CQL and SQL as to what that relates to, it's pretty high co-occurrence. And then the difference there is like, YAR has a whole set of other stuff that isn't part of that, right? So if you did malware analysis and you look at this binary and you pull all this other stuff in there, okay, yeah, certainly going to be, either network or, endpoint, but probably more endpoint. But the interesting part is where that kind of ideology of this taxonomy that we're now going to write, Max, we're going to do that, might be applicable, right, to where that can be accounted for. Um, and I think that's really interesting to consider. And so, does the new sort of coalition of OCSF sort of help path some of the stuff out? I don't see that right now. What I see is I see the federation across different sort of languages is really there, but the understanding of the why do I coalesce those languages into something that is more descriptive that I can write more things about? That's the important thing for us to jam on. And I think that's undone. That's undone work.
On these words of wisdom, thanks a lot for coming in. That was a really great chat. I mean, hey, like there's so much to be done here. If somebody wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way of doing that?
Yeah, Fred at detecteam.com, LinkedIn, X or, whatever. Mastodon, all good. Um, yeah, man. Appreciate the opportunity to come and hang out. I love that you guys are doing this in the space. I think it's deeply valuable to the community, and I want to see it grow.
Awesome, awesome. All right,
Awesome.
thanks.